This is the video animated version of the Radwa&Radwa podcast, where we aim to communicate scientific research to science enthusiasts. We post 4 versions of each episode, in English and Arabic, and in podcast and YouTube video formats. All the links are in the description below. You will also find our references in the description. We are your hosts, Radwa&Ewaisha,
and Radwa Sharaf.
PhDs, pharmacists, and molecular biologists.
In our episode today, we will be continuing our discussion from the previous 2 episodes where we spoke about how everything around us is actually a chemical and how natural is not necessarily better. In our last episode, Radwa told us that what makes a chemical toxic or not isn't whether it's natural or synthetic. So, Radwa, I have to ask, what makes a chemical toxic then?
That's a great question. So let me tell you about Paracelsus, who's considered to be the father of toxicology. So Paracelsus put the first law of toxicology, and he said that the dose makes the poison. Basically, everything around us is a poison. And what actually dictates whether this chemical is going to be toxic or not is how much we consume of this chemical.
So can you give us, Radwa, a few examples of compounds that can be consumed in a low dose and are toxic versus those that have to be consumed at high doses in order to be toxic?
Yeah, we think of water as something that is very safe, and it's very safe. But if you consume 6 liters of water at once, it can be fatal. And the same goes with coffee. Consuming 42 cups of coffee in one sitting can be lethal. There is a very unusual incident that happened to a man in Massachusetts. He died after consuming a bag of licorice candy every day for 3 weeks. And that's because licorice, just like any chemical, if consumed in very large amounts, it can have effects on our body and how our body functions. And so this man died because of high cortisol levels and changes in blood pressure that caused his death. There are also other examples of natural substances that are very, very toxic. The poison that is considered the deadliest poison in the world is Botox. And 70 nanograms can kill a 70-kilogram person. And Botox comes from a natural source. It's from the bacteria Clostridium botulinum. There's also ricin, which is a substance that is extracted from beans of castor oil. It's one of the deadliest poisons in the world, and we usually think of castor oil as something that is very safe and very natural, but we wouldn't think that the beans of this plant contain a very, very deadly poison, and it comes from a natural source. There are also examples of natural compounds that, if we modify these compounds, we can get synthetic derivatives that are less toxic. Think of opium. So opium is a plant from which we extract morphine, and morphine is used as a painkiller. And if we think of other synthetic derivatives that have been made from morphine, some of these are less toxic. They could be less potent, but they're also less toxic. So synthetic modification to these natural compounds can actually make them less toxic.
So it's really the dose that dictates whether or not a compound is toxic or not. I think most people view toxicity more as black and white. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, that's, I think, because many people are so scared of the word chemical, which is chemophobia, which we talked about in a previous episode. So people usually think of substances in the world as either natural, which is safe, and chemical, which is unsafe or toxic. And that is a false dichotomy. Everything around us is a chemical, and its origin does not dictate whether it's safe or not. We get so many messages on WhatsApp and we see them on social media that scare people. They tell people that this substance in this vaccine is toxic, or this substance in that food is toxic. And the word toxic here is not very accurate because toxic is not really black and white. It really depends on how much we're consuming of that substance. If there's a substance in a certain drug, then this has to have been tested, and the toxic dose is well known. Just the fact that this substance exists or this chemical exists in a drug or in a food doesn't necessarily make the whole drug or the whole food toxic.
So can you talk to us a little bit about how scientists determine what the safe dose of a drug or a compound is that's administered to humans?
That's actually a very important question. So, in order for a drug to proceed from the research lab to the market, it has to go through several phases of testing. It has to meet regulatory requirements of safety and efficacy. There's first preclinical testing in cells or in animals, and then it proceeds to clinical trials. So, phase one of clinical trials is for demonstrating safety. And it tests a dose range starting at a low dose below what is required for the drug to be effective, and then the dose is increased. And so that is why it takes years for a drug to reach the market. There's phase one clinical trials, and then it goes through phase two, phase three, and then in the end, once it meets all of the regulatory requirements, it can be marketed. And then there's post marketing surveillance. If we compare that to herbal medicines, there are several reasons why safety studies would be more complicated in natural or herbal medicines. First, is that if you're using an entire plant or a herbal, there are so many chemicals in that herbal, just like all cells have many chemicals, and there's just so many components, and it's hard to predict what each one of these components is going to do and whether each one of them is actually safe and what the safe dose is for each one of those. There's also so much variation between batches when preparing a natural product or a herbal, and that's normal to have batch to batch variation. There's also that you never really know how much of the active ingredients you're using in your herbal preparation. It is difficult to standardize. Many of these are also marketed as dietary supplements, and dietary supplements do not have to meet the same rigorous safety evaluation process as drugs that are marketed by pharmaceutical companies as actual drugs. And so it's important to keep that in mind when we're thinking of something as a chemical versus natural, and we're thinking that chemical is going to be bad for our body or toxic, and we think that natural is going to be inherently better or safer.
Thanks, Radwa. So, to summarize what we said in today's episode and what we discussed in the previous two episodes, everything around us is a chemical, even water itself. It's a chemical compound at the end of the day. And a compound being derived from a natural source doesn't mean that it's inherently better or safer. And remember that when you hear the word toxic, it's not black and white. The dose really is what dictates whether or not a compound is poisonous or not. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to our podcast and our YouTube channel. You can also find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Feel free to reach out with suggestions for future episodes or leave us a comment directly on our YouTube video. See you next time!